It always feels easier in the moment to step back, to disconnect, to silence the emotions that feel too big to handle. For the avoidant, pushing someone away brings a sense of immediate relief. The noise quiets, the tension eases, and the pressure to open up disappears. For a while, that distance feels like peace. But what they don't realize is that the silence they create begins to speak louder than any argument ever could. That silence is the beginning of what we call the emotional hangover, the delayed crash that follows emotional withdrawal. At first, it feels clean. The air seems lighter, their thoughts sharper. They convince themselves they've made the right decision. I just needed space. It's better this way. They dive into work, distractions, or solitude, telling themselves they're fine. But emotional avoidance doesn't erase connection. It only delays its impact, because emotions don't disappear, they wait. And when the adrenaline of detachment fades, reality steps in. That's when the emptiness begins to whisper. The emotional hangover doesn't arrive as a dramatic moment of realization. It sneaks in quietly. It's in the stillness of the night, when the phone doesn't light up anymore. It's in the songs that suddenly feel different. It's in the small, familiar routines that no longer bring comfort. The very peace they once craved begins to feel like loneliness, and the freedom they fought for starts to feel like exile. The human heart can't thrive in permanent isolation. It was never designed to. Avoidants often underestimate the power of emotional residue. They think walking away ends the story, but endings have echoes. They echo in memories, in regrets, in the weight of unsaid words. What starts as relief turns into reflection, not because they want to revisit pain, but because the mind naturally revisits meaning. The truth they avoided starts to surface, that the connection they pushed away wasn't suffocation, it was safety. And when they realize that, guilt begins to blur the edges of their calm. That's when the emotional hangover hits hardest. Not because they suddenly miss the person, but because they finally feel the cost of their distance. It's the moment when control turns into loss, and silence turns into self-confrontation. They start to replay conversations in their head, not to find blame, but to understand. They remember the look on that person's face when things began to change. The confusion, the disappointment, the quiet acceptance. And that memory stings more than any argument ever could. The emotional hangover is painful, because it's honest. It strips away the narratives avoidants tell themselves. That they're better off alone, that emotions are messy, that attachment leads to pain. But underneath those stories lies the simple truth: they cared. They always did. They just didn't know how to stay close without feeling exposed. And now, without that connection, they realize how much of their peace depended on being seen by someone who truly understood them. The irony of avoidance is that it protects you from pain only to deliver it later, amplified. Because you can suppress emotions, but you can't erase them. The heart has a memory far longer than the mind's justifications. Over time, the avoidant begins to feel the imbalance, the ache of unfinished feelings, the exhaustion of constant self-protection. The same walls that once felt like safety now feel like a cage. And yet, this emotional hangover has purpose. It's the moment life demands reflection. It's the space where avoidance meets accountability. In that discomfort lies the chance for awareness, the understanding that intimacy isn't the enemy. The pain of the hangover becomes the lesson. That connection only feels dangerous to those who've never learned that love can exist without loss. So the emotional hangover isn't just regret, it's a reckoning. It's the moment when the heart whispers the truth the mind tried to avoid. You didn't want to lose them, you wanted to feel safe with them. And realizing that, deeply, quietly, completely, is often the beginning of healing. Starts quietly. The avoidant sits in the calm after the storm, convinced that distance was the best choice. They tell themselves they needed space, they needed clarity, they needed to breathe again. And for a brief moment, they do. There's a temporary peace that follows disconnection, a silence that feels like safety. But soon, that silence begins to change its shape. What once felt like relief starts to echo with something heavier. That's the emotional hangover, the emotional recall that comes after pushing someone away who truly mattered. At first, they mistake it for freedom. They finally have their routine back, their control, their solitude. No more vulnerability, no more emotional risk. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, That solitude begins to feel too quiet. They start noticing the absence, the empty good mornings, the silence at night where a familiar voice used to be. It's not dramatic, it's subtle, creeping in through the cracks of daily life. They tell themselves it's nothing, but the truth is, that's when the emotional hangover begins to take hold. Avoidants are often masters of suppression. They don't deny emotion because they don't feel it. They deny it because they feel it too deeply. So they pack those emotions away, storing them neatly behind logic and rationalization. But the human mind isn't built to outrun what the heart refuses to release. Over time, those suppressed emotions resurface in unexpected ways, through restlessness, irritability, even dreams. It's as if the body itself begins to protest the disconnect. And when that happens, they realize that what they thought they escaped was only waiting for them to slow down. The emotional hangover is cruel because it's delayed. It doesn't strike while adrenaline is high. It waits until the calm returns. That's when reflection becomes unavoidable. The avoidant begins to remember the little things, the sound of laughter, the shared inside jokes, the feeling of being understood. Those memories come uninvited, sometimes triggered by a song, a scent, or a passing moment that feels too familiar. Each one brings a pang of realization that control was an illusion, and what they truly lost wasn't space, it was connection. And that's where the guilt begins. Not because they meant to hurt anyone, but because they see it now. The other person's patience, their effort, their quiet confusion when things began to shift. The avoidant remembers those moments vividly, but at the time, they couldn't stay present enough to appreciate them. Fear always spoke louder than affection. And now, without that person's presence, the fear turns inward. The questions start to surface. Why did I run? What was I protecting myself from? That's the hardest part of the emotional hangover. The internal dialogue. Because avoidance isn't just a reaction. It's a story we tell ourselves to survive. It's the story that says, if I keep my distance, I can't be disappointed. But when love was real, that story no longer holds up. The avoidant begins to see that what they called independence was often isolation, and what they called safety was actually fear in disguise. They start to feel the contradiction between who they want to be, strong, composed, untouchable, and who they really are underneath, someone longing to be understood but terrified to be known. The hangover lingers because there's no easy antidote. No distraction fills the gap of genuine connection. They might throw themselves into work, into friends, into noise, but the quiet moments still come, and with them, the weight of self-awareness. The mind replays the decisions, the conversations, the turning points. The avoidant begins to see that they didn't just push away a partner, they pushed away an opportunity to grow, to heal, to trust. That realization doesn't come with tears at first, it comes with silence, the kind that makes them finally face themselves. And yet, hidden within that pain is the beginning of change. The emotional hangover isn't punishment, it's awakening. It's the emotional mirror showing them what their avoidance has cost them. They start to see that the very vulnerability they feared is also the key to peace. That love, at its healthiest, doesn't take away freedom, it expands it. But the hangover has to hurt first. It has to reveal the truth before healing can happen. So they sit with it. The silence, the memories, the ache. It's no longer about the person they lost. It's about the part of themselves they abandoned along the way. The emotional hangover forces them to confront that truth, that protecting themselves from pain also meant protecting themselves from love. And that's the kind of realization that lingers long after the goodbye, echoing quietly in the corners of their heart. Asking the same question over and over, was the distance worth the cost? It always begins with good intentions. The avoidant doesn't wake up one morning deciding to sabotage a relationship. They tell themselves they're simply protecting their peace. When emotions start to feel overwhelming or vulnerability starts knocking at the door, they reach for the one thing that has always made them feel safe: distance. To them, that distance isn't coldness, it's control. It's the invisible shield that keeps them from being hurt. But what they don't see in that moment is how the same wall they build for protection slowly becomes the barrier that isolates them from the very love they crave. It's a subtle transition, one that happens so quietly it often goes unnoticed. In the beginning, They convince themselves they're setting healthy boundaries. They rationalize that needing space is a sign of maturity, of emotional intelligence. And sometimes it is. But over time, what starts as a boundary becomes avoidance. They begin to retreat not to recharge, but to escape. Each time they feel the weight of emotional closeness, they step back just a little further. They say, I just need to focus on myself. Or, I'm not ready for something serious. Not realizing those words are slowly turning into excuses to keep their hearts safe, but empty. The line between self-protection and self-sabotage is razor thin. On one side lies the strength to honor your emotional limits. On the other lies the fear of being seen too deeply. For avoidance, that line is constantly blurred. They think they're preserving peace, but what they're really preserving is fear. Because when love starts to feel real, when it's no longer a fantasy, but a presence that asks for trust, openness, and consistency, it activates their deepest wound, the fear of losing themselves in someone else. So they pull back, they create space, they silence their feelings, thinking it will keep them safe. But love doesn't exist in distance, it breathes through presence. And every time they withdraw, they send a silent message, not just to the person who loves them, but to themselves, that intimacy is dangerous. They reinforce the very belief they've carried for years, that getting close always leads to pain. This becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more they protect themselves, the more disconnected they become. And eventually, the safety they were trying to preserve begins to feel like loneliness. Self-sabotage often hides behind logic. It's the voice that says, this isn't the right time, or they deserve someone better. It sounds rational, but underneath, it's pure fear. The avoidant learns to intellectualize their emotions because emotions to them are unpredictable. They make them feel exposed. So, they use logic as armor. They analyze instead of feel, explain instead of express. But logic can't quiet the ache that comes when they realize they've pushed away something genuine. The mind tries to justify, but the heart always knows when it's lost something real. The heartbreaking part is that self-sabotage doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like silence. It's the unanswered message, the slow fade, the polite but distant tone that replaces warmth. It's the little ways they detach before anyone notices, convincing themselves they're preventing future pain. But in doing so, they create the very pain they were trying to avoid. That's the paradox of avoidance. The act of protecting themselves becomes the act of wounding themselves. And when the silence finally settles, when the person they pushed away stops reaching out, the truth starts to echo in that empty space. They begin to realize that safety without connection isn't peace, it's emptiness. They start to see that real safety doesn't come from walls, it comes from trust. Trust in themselves to handle emotions, to communicate, to stay present even when things get hard. Because protection built on fear can only ever lead to loss. There's a quiet moment in every avoidance journey when they recognize the pattern. That every time love gets close, they find a reason to run. And in that moment, the truth hits hard. What they've been calling protection has really been avoidance of growth. Every withdrawal, every escape, every dismissal of emotion has been a small act of self-sabotage disguised as strength. And maybe the hardest part of all is that they often realize this too late, when the person who once reached for them has learned to stop trying. When the silence they created is no longer temporary, but permanent. That's when the reality sets in. The love they lost wasn't the threat, it was the cure. And all the protection in the world couldn't save them from the pain of realizing they were the ones who broke what they most wanted to keep. It often takes losing something irreplaceable to realize what was truly at stake. For the avoidant, that realization doesn't come in a moment of chaos. It comes in the stillness that follows. After the distance, after the silence, when there's no one left to blame and nowhere left to hide, awareness begins to whisper. It's a quiet, uncomfortable truth that starts to form in the back of their mind. Every wall they built, every step they took away from intimacy, was never protecting them, it was isolating them. And that's where growth begins. Not in the safety of avoidance, but in the raw honesty of awareness. Awareness is painful because it shatters illusion. It takes all the carefully crafted justifications. I'm not ready. I need my space. I don't want to get hurt. And holds them up to the light. Suddenly, those words stop sounding like boundaries and start sounding like barriers. Awareness doesn't accuse or condemn, it simply reveals. It shows the avoidant how much of their behavior wasn't strength, but fear wearing strength's disguise. And once that truth is seen, it can't be unseen. At first, awareness feels like loss. It's the loss of the story they've always told themselves. That they're better off alone, that emotions are dangerous, that love demands too much. But beneath that loss lies the beginning of understanding. Awareness creates space between reaction and reflection. It's the moment when the avoidant finally asks, "Why do I run when someone gets close? What am I so afraid of losing?" Those questions are the keys that unlock the patterns they've lived in for years. Growth doesn't happen through guilt, it happens through curiosity. The avoidant learns that awareness isn't about shame. It's about recognition. Recognizing that the fear of intimacy often comes from a fear of losing control. Recognizing that they equated love with danger because, at some point, closeness was painful. Recognizing that their independence became a shield against vulnerability. This is where the healing begins, not by condemning their patterns, but by understanding their origins. Because once they see the story behind their fear, they have the power to rewrite it. Awareness turns avoidance into accountability. It allows the avoidant to see how their silence, their withdrawal, their emotional distance didn't just protect them. It impacted someone else. It invites empathy where defensiveness used to live. For the first time, they begin to see the other side eye. How it felt for someone to love them through that wall. To keep trying to reach a heart that wouldn't open. And that realization, that someone's love wasn't the threat they thought it was, becomes the turning point. But awareness isn't gentle. It stings because it exposes both the fear and the cost of living with it. The avoidant begins to see the pattern repeating in every connection. The same withdrawal, the same longing, the same loneliness. And in that repetition, awareness becomes impossible to ignore. The pain that once felt like an enemy becomes a teacher. It teaches them that vulnerability isn't the opposite of strength, it's the foundation of it. It teaches them that emotional safety isn't found in isolation, but in honesty. That's the quiet beauty of awareness. It transforms pain into purpose. Once they see their patterns clearly, they can begin to make different choices. It starts small, a longer conversation instead of silence, a question instead of avoidance, a moment of honesty instead of retreat. Each act of openness chips away at the walls they've spent years building. And slowly, they start to feel what connection without fear actually feels like, not suffocating, not consuming, but liberating. The journey from avoidance to awareness is not easy, but it's the only path that leads to growth. Because awareness doesn't just show them what they've done, it shows them who they can become. It's the bridge between fear and freedom. It's the moment they realize that love doesn't require losing themselves. It requires finding the courage to be seen exactly as they are. And when that awareness finally settles, when it stops feeling like shame and starts feeling like truth, something extraordinary happens. The avoidant, for the first time, starts to feel safe not because they're hidden, but because they're understood. That's when growth becomes real. That's when awareness turns into transformation. And that's when the person who once ran from love begins, quietly but courageously, to turn back toward it.